said, I'm a psychologist at Memorial. I've been specializing in oncology care, meaning I'm a psychologist who specializes in working with people who have been diagnosed with cancer and are going through cancer treatment for more years than I would care to count, maybe almost 25 years. And I also see caregivers, schedule permitting, because oftentimes, as we unfortunately know, sometimes being a caregiver can be harder, at least emotionally, than being a patient. So, having said that, well, I don't remember the first time I went to Gilda's Club. It was a long time ago in the old house, what's now the old house with the peacocks around. And I would like to say that I first sat down next to somebody who was going through treatment for cancer in 1998. And the changes in cancer care since then have been absolutely astounding. Obviously not enough. We would like more to happen. But the changes in cancer care and how much better people are doing with cancer diagnoses in general, also how much better they're doing with the side effects and with how much better the treatments have gotten. Not enough. There's still a lot of room for improvement. I'm sure everybody will agree. One thing that hasn't changed though, one thing that hasn't changed in the last 25 years, or for that matter, for the last 250,000 years, is the human mind and the human emotional experience and what happens when we're confronted with something as challenging as a cancer diagnosis. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, let's see here. Yeah, computer's a little rusty, little Charlie horse on the cursors here. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today are distilled from the research perspectives, but they're also very much things that I've seen real world perspective from the bedside, from working with people, talking to people, and also, because who gets sick? Everybody gets sick. Everybody knows somebody. Everybody has somebody in their family. Everybody has a friend. And, if I'm at Gilda's Club, obviously it's all you. But this stuff affects us healthcare workers too. And these principles of the mind and coping, they're applicable to everybody. And it's not necessarily just unique to the setting of cancer. So, for instance, if you've been through any sort of period in your life where there's a lot of uncertainty, you felt vulnerable, there's some very unpleasant but very predictable consequences and processes that happen to us. So these are really the two major aspects that I see in cancer treatment that people have to wrestle with. These two pillars, they coexist: uncertainty and vulnerability. A diagnosis is made, and we all walk around with an implicit map of our future. We all walk around with an assumption that it's was it July 14th today, and July 20th, July 24th, it's August, it's fall, and spend the holidays here or there. We all have a fantasy in our heads about what our lives are going to be. We contextualize our lives in time and in relationships. And when this diagnosis hits, it's sort of like this beautiful porcelain bowl just shatters into a million pieces, and you don't know what's going to come next. All of a sudden, you get that diagnosis, and the uncertainty takes over. For a lot of us, there's fog, not quite sure where to go. And those first meetings that you have with your medical team, they're kind of almost like the first day of school in some ways. These people are so much more important than you, and they're going to determine the course of your life. Well, we human beings, whenever we're faced with uncertainty, it exposes us, and we feel a sense of vulnerability too. And so many of us will start to feel existential distress, feelings of panic, feelings of helplessness almost. We may develop new phobias. We may redevelop phobias that we thought we had resolved. Panic attacks. More commonly than panic attacks, what I experience when I'm talking to people is this kind of low rumbling boil of anxiety. Pressure in your chest. You feel like somebody's sitting on your chest sometimes. Short, quick breaths. You have to kind of force yourself to take a deep breath from time to time. And it's very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to spend 10 minutes in this state. It's uncomfortable to spend a day in this state. Well, I think some of us, we spend days, weeks, months, and even years in this state. It doesn't seem possible that we can. So oftentimes it's uncertainty and vulnerability. It'll come up with the first symptoms. Perhaps you felt a lump. Perhaps you had um, a discharge that was bloody and it was alarming, or you coughed it up, or anywhere else. Or there was a new pain that just kind of seemed different from all the other pains that you've experienced with aging. Um, those first symptoms that don't go away, those first symptoms that compel us to take a look, where your doctor said, I see something, I don't really like the look of it. I want you to go to an ultrasound or an MRI or a CT or a specialist. And that kind of uncertainty and vulnerability just opens up. So every subsequent milestone in treatment and survivorship reactivates this kind of epicenter, this diagnostic epicenter of uncertainty and vulnerability. I had this conversation twice today with two different patients. They are doing great. They did great with their diagnosis, with their treatment planning. They got their chemo. They really just sort of the uh, the whole kind of workup phase that you would think is the most jarring for everybody. They handled the workup phase beautifully, just sailed right through. The end of treatment is when they're experiencing this idea emotionally of like this porcelain ball shattering into a million pieces of their future. Um, it it's different for everybody, and I think if there's one thing I can encourage all of us to accept and really start to talk to all of our social contacts about, because there's a lot of assumptions in society about what people are supposed to do when they're diagnosed with cancer. There's no cookie cutter approaches. There are tendencies, there are commonalities, there are threads that we have in common with people, but nobody goes through this thing the same way as somebody else. There are similarities for sure, but I think it's important that we as caregivers, we as patients, and we as culture start to recognize that there's very few checklists of what you're supposed to have done emotionally. We all try to do the best we can. So some people will feel this chasm of uncertainty and vulnerability. They'll feel it open up at diagnosis. Other people will feel it open up at the end of treatment when the oncologist says, go live your life. I'll see you in 3 months or 6 months. Or it's that first follow-up scan. This is something I hear so much about. So all of these are very normative. And, the theme that we're talking about, knowledge is power, right? If we know that the uncertainty and vulnerability are just part of this process, it actually empowers us when we're faced with uncertainty and vulnerability that, oh, these are some physiological and emotional buttons that are going to get pushed in me right now. It's normal. I'm not losing my mind. I'm not crazy, right? I'm not doing something that is completely off the wall that nobody's ever done before. This is the human experience. The other thing is that these processes tend to be cumulative, meaning each time it opens up, sometimes when you're faced with uncertainty and vulnerability in one domain, sort of the body has a way of remembering all the other instances when there was uncertainty and vulnerability. It starts to maybe go back to that time when you got dumped in middle school by your middle school crush, or that time you got fired from that job that you thought you would have until retirement, or that relationship that didn't work. I mean, we just start getting this weird cascade, this waterfall of memories. All the times when the futures that we thought we had kind of nailed, that they just disappeared from our lives, and the uncertainty and vulnerability that we felt. So I would definitely consider a cancer diagnosis. I'm not alone in this. I would definitely consider a cancer diagnosis to be stressful and traumatic. Um, it isn't for everybody. Remember, there's no cookie cutter approaches. So sometimes people have different family histories. There's plenty of people I've worked with who were almost sort of expecting it, so it wasn't very stressful or traumatic. They were kind of like, okay, so now we can finally do something with it. But for a lot of people, it's stressful and it's traumatic. If the diagnosis is not, then some of the treatments we have, as better as they've gotten since I started working in this setting in 1998, they're still not good enough. Many of you can tell me more than I can tell you that these treatments can be very unpleasant and they can be traumatic. What we know about stress and trauma is that they tend to amplify what's already there, meaning the aspects of a person's life. It's like the stress and trauma hold a magnifying lens emotionally. And these things that we've had in our lives, they tend to have a greater emotional impact on us, for better or for worse, for better or for worse. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. They amplify the nature of marriage, family, of support systems, of emotions, of coping skills, something I've been sharing with people since the beginning. One of the first things I saw, and it's still universal. I'm sure some of you, when it comes to amplifying your support systems, absolutely surprised and shocked by who stepped up and who stepped away. I've heard this time and again from so many people that the people they were closest to have disappeared, and the people they sort of were okay with have really stepped up. And they're new best friends. Same thing in family. We all know somebody in our circle who likes to make it all about themselves, right? That's not going to change probably. A lot of times we kind of hope that people will become their best possible self after a diagnosis, or they will treat you with their best possible self after you've been diagnosed. Unfortunately, that isn't always the case. We're human beings. We're not completely in charge of other people. So marriages, when it comes to that, sometimes they become very tight. Sometimes there's no change, and sometimes they fall apart. They amplify what's already there. They amplify what's already there. So it's kind of like, I guess, if you were to take a car and drive it at very high speeds for a long time, stress out the car in terms of engineering, put stress on the car, you find out what parts are working, what parts aren't. It's the same thing with us humans in our relationships. Emotions also. If we have our go-to, and many of us, I would say maybe the majority of us human beings in this world, or at least in our corner of the world, we have a tendency to loathe ourselves when we're distressed. We come down really hard on ourselves when we're stressed out, when we're depressed, when we're anxious. So the self-talk just is not very soothing. That's the one that I really try to be careful about. Are you okay with yourself not being okay? That's a shockingly hard question sometimes to ask ourselves, if we're okay with ourselves not being okay. Sometimes there's nothing we can do about it either. And the other thing that gets amplified often is coping skills. And I'm going to spend some more time talking about that. Um, I don't think any of us really learned what healthy coping skills were in school or with our families of origin. We've had to kind of figure it out on our own. Sometimes we've had some pretty nasty falls along the way to figure out what works and what doesn't, alcohol addictions and things like that. So these coping skills are something that I'm going to come back to in a little bit. But let's talk a little bit about the emotions during cancer, diagnosis and treatment. There's no sort of like one thing that people experience, although there may be tendencies towards one of these. So in psychology and mental health research, we think of distress is the word we use. We don't use depression unless you're studying depression specifically. We don't use anxiety unless you're studying anxiety specifically. And we don't use anger unless we're studying anger specifically. This kind of natural, general, just don't feel good emotionally. Emotionally, I'm just not well. We think of that as distress. And distress is a broad umbrella, and it has three valid avenues for expression. Depression is the one that comes to mind most often. People are sad, they're crying, they're distressed. Anxiety is also one of those avenues. People are anxious, they're having panic attacks maybe, very worried. And this is also distress. It's the same underlying energy. Anger, most difficult thing to be around. Nobody wants to be around anger. It's the same underlying energy as depression and anxiety. It's distress. It's the same energy. So what's interesting about anger, some people say that depression turned inward, but some people say distress turned inward is depression, distress turned outward is anger, but it's the same energy. I'm not sure I completely believe that 100% of the time, but sometimes it's the case. Now, I put steroids under each of these because steroids can also cause that and inflame anything. I've generally thought of steroids as being one of the most profoundly mood-altering substances in cancer treatment, people get just out of control emotions. Not everybody, and not always, but often. Um, I've always characterized it with people that steroids will give you excess energy, and depending on the circumstance and your disposition, is how to express that excess energy. So for instance, in one person, she decided that she was going to repaint her bathroom at 2 a.m. because she was wired, just wired from the steroids before her chemo. Somebody else may turn that into rage and destroy their own car or destroy their furniture. Somebody else, most people I think are going to, or they experience that increased appetite that comes with steroids. Well, shouldn't say appetite. This is a distinction I make. Oftentimes steroids will increase food craving, but you still lack an appetite. So it's kind of like you're just eating a bucket of food and you don't know why. It's steroids. So a lot of times we have to be very careful. Are these emotions a natural response to vulnerability, or are they medically induced? Are they medication induced? And if they're medication induced, my go-to is usually to check and see if steroids may be aggravating it. What's the solution? Temporary. Sometimes there are solutions to it that can be temporary, maybe something to help people relax while they're getting the steroids. It's pretty standard. Using antidepressants in the setting of steroids can be very tricky. Some people can get thrown into a manic type of episode, which is unwieldy and unpredictable. So let's talk a little bit about how do we deal with uncertainty and vulnerability. Well, we have to meet our old friend stress, our old friend fight or flight response. Why am I calling it an old friend? Am I absolutely crazy? What's wrong with me? Stress is so unpleasant. Stress is unpleasant, but think of it this way. Stress is another way of describing our survival skills. This is what our minds are for 100% of the time. And working with people going through cancer treatment has taught me this. The job of the mind is not to make us happy. The job of the mind is not to make us happy, it's to keep the body alive. And in order to keep the body alive, it has to focus on danger, fear, uncertainty, and vulnerability. So this stress response that we really don't like so much, so uncomfortable, I don't like it either. It's exactly what the mind is supposed to do. It's exactly what the brain is supposed to do. It knows how to do it really, really, really well. In fact, I will say that this stress response is the legacy of our most ancient ancestors that has gone, it gets better with every generation. We get better at stress with every generation. The job of the mind is to keep us alive. And in order to do that, we have to focus on where's the uncertainty and vulnerability. So I'm sure many of you have had these moments when you're like, I just don't want to think about cancer. I don't want to deal with it at all. Just one afternoon, I'm just going to take the day off. I'm not going to do anything about it. And what do? It's like telling you not to think of a pink elephant, right? First thing you think of is a pink elephant. It doesn't work. Why? Because the mind is gravitating towards that uncertainty and vulnerability because that's what it's supposed to do. So fight or flight is not just a mental process. It's wired throughout our body, mind and the brain connected to the body to activate this stress response, this beautiful, elegant stress response, which feels absolutely lousy. But for hundreds of thousands of years, it's kept us alive. So it's a cascade of responses that begin in the brain, affect the body. It's preparing for danger. What's been the longest existing type of danger for human beings? Being attacked by wild animals. Honestly, we don't think of it so much in South Florida unless, anything's possible in Florida. That somebody left a shark in downtown Miami several years ago. My kids get a kick out of that story. It wasn't swimming, but anything can happen. But this is the danger our bodies are prepared to deal with. What happens when you're attacked by a wild animal? You either have to play dead or you have to fight to the death. Fight or flight. You run away, play dead, or fight. And so this is what the body prepares to do. It starts to have some changes in the body and how blood is circulated. So, you can sacrifice an arm or a leg, but not your organs. So the blood rushes into the center of your body, and you may feel a cold flush in your hands and your feet. You may feel a flash of cold or even a hot flash sometimes. The opposite of that. Your appetite gets screwy. For some of us, stress equals famine. So we start to stock up on calories, usually junky calories. For some of us, stress means run, get away from it. So we lose our appetite because it's easier to run away with an empty stomach. That also translates into loosening the bowels. So a lot of people with irritable bowel, for instance, stress response activates the irritable bowel. What helps treat the irritable bowel? Antidepressants can help treat irritable bowels. So all these mechanisms they're not by accident. They're all there created for a reason, an elegant reason to keep us alive and preserve the body. So the other thing that starts to happen, I'm going to come back to this. If we're going to either not bleed to death, run as fast as we can, sprinting, or we're going to play dead, we have to take very short, quick, shallow breaths. And some of you, when you're stressed out, when you're in the waiting room, in the exam room, waiting for the doctor to come in, you'll catch yourself and gotta take a deep breath, gotta take a deep breath, because your body's been doing this shallow breathing for so long that it just feels aggravated, That shallow breathing is not an accident. It's what the body's designed to do. It's designed to keep us out of danger, lay dead, or run away. Either way, you're going to be taking these short, quick, shallow breaths. The other thing with a stress response, rumination, just thinking about the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. I'm sure you've had this experience. You go for a scan and you're hypervigilant. What's the tech look like? What's the expression on the tech's face? Is the tech scared? Is the tech happy? Most people do this. They kind of go in for the scan and you're just kind of wondering what the tech is going to look like. And then you start ruminating about that. 2 a.m., you wake up in the morning. The tech did look worried, didn't he? No, I don't know if he was worried. And we just start ruminating about these little things, thinking about the same thing over and over and over again. For some reason in our brains, 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. seem to be prime problem solving times. We wake up and we start thinking about this stuff. And very rarely is a solution to be found at that time. The other thing about fight or flight responses is we start to have anticipatory emotions. I'm going to feel blank. I'm going to be devastated. I'm going to be overjoyed. And the other thing that happens with those is we start to stack our feelings. So we have feelings about feelings. We get upset because if we have bad news next week, we're going to be very sad. So now we're going to spend a whole week upset about something we don't know about, anticipating what our emotions are going to be. That sets us up for, I'm not going to say emotional failure, but an emotional struggle for sure. So it's a challenge. One of the things about the stress response that I've become very sensitive to is that there seems to be a parallel process in the brain. If we're going to run really quickly, we have to go through the jungle or the savannah, or wherever it is that our species evolved. We have to go through there very quickly. And in order to do that, we have to kind of have a sense of movement through nature. And fast enough that we don't trip and fall on something we don't see. So we become hypervigilant. This is where the ruminative tendency comes from. The other thing, moving through distance, we consider that moving through time. So when we're in this ruminative phase of distress, we're usually projecting out into the future, fantasizing about good, bad, usually bad things, because our mind is fixated on uncertainty, that which scares us, that which will diminish our capacity to live. And we start to sort of spinning these stories almost out of control. They seem so real and they feel so very real, but they're not very helpful. So what do we do about it, right? This is the most important part. So we know all this about stress. We're starting to learn so much more about stress in the body. I do want to touch on one thing, which is, does stress cause cancer? After 25 years, I'm going to say, I'm not sure, maybe sometimes. The thing that I come back to, let me go back a bit, the thing I go back to over and over again when it comes to, does stress cause cancer, is I ask myself, does the answer to that question help your stress? Because if I tell you that stress causes cancer, then we get more stressed about our stress. If I tell you it doesn't cause cancer, we get stressed because you won't believe me. That's what happens to most people. Right now, the state of the research, the last I checked, the state of the research is that stress may not cause initial cancer diagnoses, but in some instances, for some people, it may influence whether they recur or not, which is a very vague finding to generalize out into the population. Now, what are we supposed to do with that kind of information? Get rid of stress completely? How's that going to work? That's impossible. So I question kind of not only the how realistic it is to carry out this kind of work, but how realistic it is to make it actionable. What are we going to do if we find out that stress causes cancer? 2022, what are we going to do? Get rid of stress? Impossible. This is what our minds are made for. Um, Medications? Well, maybe, but I have yet to see anything saying that people who are on antidepressants going through cancer treatment are living significantly longer than people who are not on antidepressants going through cancer treatment. Similarly, and this is very sad as a psychologist to come to terms with because we like to think that our minds are so powerful that makes our role so important, right? That it can influence outcomes of recurrence and cancer prevention. But it turns out in some of the largest studies that have been done comparing outlook, positive thinking or um, meaning in life. Well, meaning is a separate category, but positive thinking, which is something that our culture stresses so much. Sometimes it's nauseating how positive we're supposed to be. Um, doesn't extend people's lives for one day. What it does is make them easier to be around, and maybe it'll make our experience of life more pleasant. But a lot of times, I think the assumption we have is that if you're positive, you'll live longer, and the science doesn't really pan that out so much. So I think it's more important is to be yourself, to come to terms with yourself and your emotional process, and to be at ease with your stress response, which honestly we don't have a whole lot of control over as much as we would like. We can make it better, but we can't turn it off. I think better is okay. Better is a noble goal, and we can work our way towards that. So, what are these coping skills? How do we make our stress coping and stress management better? Um, One thing to keep in mind when I talk about these coping skills, let's see, yeah, when I talk about these coping skills, is that there's a wish list that we all have, right? Like in health research, there are certain guidelines that we find in the research. And then you present these at different talks and communities and research seminars and things like that. And people go, okay, great. So I have to quit my job, get rid of my family, and then I can take care of myself, right? Because it's sometimes it's not realistic. My recommendation for most people is just do the best you can. Just do the best you can. One thing I like to point out, stress doesn't ask permission. It doesn't say, is Thursday at 5:30 a good time for me to show up and hang out with you for a while? Stress shows up unannounced, uninvited, just does its thing, stinks up the room and leaves, right? Stress doesn't ask for permission. However, the antidotes are very deliberate. We have to kind of give ourselves permission to practice some of these antidotes. The behavioral choices that we make with our time. How are we going to spend our time? And I don't want this to come across as like another list of shoulds, but tendencies. Let's try our best to make some of these healthier behavioral choices. There are certainly a lot of medications that are available. I'm sure some of you have extensive experience with these antidepressants, anxiolytics. I would say in the category of symptom management, if we're talking about stress, we have to also talk about pain. And if your pain needs are being unmet, there's only so much that your mind is going to be able to do to navigate that space. So we have to kind of take all of these things together and be realistic about what is helpful and what isn't. If you don't have the capacity to engage in any of these healthy coping skills, maybe medication is the best thing. But what we do know is that medication combined with some of these behavioral choices is better than medication alone. So I am a psychologist. I don't prescribe medications, but I can talk about them. So psychiatrists prescribe. So my skill set is really in doing everything under the sun that can help, in addition to or instead of medication. I should say psychiatric medication. So, oops. So this is what I think of. I think of stress coping as a toolkit, not just one thing. You don't put all your eggs in one basket, although some days it seems like that might be the best option, but it's a toolkit. And, different problems require different tools. So we just have to be proficient in knowing that there is more than one tool in the toolkit. So what do we know about these coping skills? What do we know about each of these bullet points? So there's a lot of, I think, expectations, myths, and research behind each of these categories. And I'm going to try to spend a little bit of time on this so that we get the sense of what we can do, what's realistic, and what's helpful and what isn't helpful. So when it comes to building this toolkit, exercise is at the top of the list. And a lot of times when people think of exercise, they think about, doing deadlifts in the gym or getting on a Peloton and, doing that for an hour, or running a marathon. Exercise is any movement. Walking, the best movement of all. Although July, South Florida, maybe it's negotiable, right? Exercise is movement. What we know is that movement has a lot of benefits in people going through cancer treatment, cancer prevention, and also on mood. One of my favorite studies, I've been citing this study for over 15 years now because it's just so fantastic. It's a group of studies where they took people who were in nursing homes, who were sedentary, over the age of 65. They matched them into 4 groups. They matched them based on depression scores, so everybody was equally depressed in each group. One group got a psychiatrist, one group got nothing, got a journal, one group got a treadmill, and one group got a treadmill with a trainer. And at various points in time, they compared how these people were doing with their depression scores. What they found was that the group that got medication, which was Zoloft in this study, they got better within about 3 or 4 weeks. Wonderful. The depression scores came down. The group that had the treadmill, they kind of got better, but it took a while longer. It started around 8 weeks. The group that got the treadmill with a trainer, by 16 weeks, you could not tell their depression scores from the medication group, meaning that the group that was exercising, supervised exercise, so you know they're doing the right dose. After about 3 or 4 months, they had that same level of reduction in depression as people who were getting antidepressants. So what was that magic dose? What was that magic dose? It was 20 to 30 minutes, mild to moderate activity, walking on a treadmill, 20 to 30 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week. That's it. Why 3 or 4 times a week? Less than that was not effective in reducing depression scores. More than that didn't help any additional reduction in depression scores. So that was kind of the sweet spot, the Goldilocks zone. 3 or 4 times a week, 20 to 30 minutes. That was enough after 3 or 4 months to reduce depression as Zoloft. Now, comparing side effects, we have a different picture. Side effects of exercise, unless you get injured, are way better than the side effects of most medications that are out there, especially when it comes to weight, sleep, libido, all of those things that mean so much to so many of us. So building a toolkit of behavioral choices, exercise is a big part of it. Diet, I'm going to touch on, I think, on the next slide. Sleep hygiene. This one's really tricky. I will say, why is it really tricky? Because a lot of the medications interfere with sleep. And so it gets really hard to kind of, especially if you've been in the hospital for a while, sleep-wake cycle gets disrupted. It's very hard to fall asleep at a normal time, wake up. A lot of different ideas about sleep and sleep hygiene. I think the most common myth is that you need to sleep 8 hours a night. That's a myth. What we really look for is, do you feel rested in the morning? I'm there at 6.5 hours. If I sleep for 8 hours, I'm groggy the rest of the day. So 6.5 for me is the sweet spot. According to some pop psychology, that's unhealthy, but it's been working for me pretty good. So do you feel rested in the morning? The most important question. Most of us, as we start to get above the age of 20 or 30, will wake up many different times during the night. Use the bathroom, shift position, hot flash. The number of times you wake up does not matter. If you wake up a lot at night, but when you wake up in the morning, you feel refreshed, you don't have a sleep issue. You don't have any sleep problems. If you wake up a lot and you wake up in the morning and you're not refreshed, then we may have some things to talk about. So one of the most important things that I need to go over when it comes to sleep hygiene is this thing, phone, telephone. Try to avoid screens in bed, please. That includes flat screen TVs, iPads, tablets, phones, smartphones, Kindles to a lesser extent, because Kindles actually have better light. They are 100% in. So the use of cell phones or flat screen TVs in the bedroom, 100% of the time in my patients who have insomnia, they're using those devices. Now, plenty of people use those devices and sleep just fine. In fact, they'll sleep with a TV on. Simple rule in psychology: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So if it's working, it's working. So the first thing is, I think, most important thing is try to avoid flat screens in bed. Try to go to bed at the same time. Try to wake up. Expose yourself to sunlight when you wake up in the morning. Activate that. There's some medications you need to be avoiding sunlight, so please pay attention to that. But it helps regulate the sleep-wake cycle. Why do the flat screens, why are they so bad for sleep? The glare, it wakes our eyes up. So your mind and body may be exhausted, but your eyes are nowhere ready to go to sleep. So there's a conflict in the brain between waking up and going to sleep. Meditation and breath awareness. This is something I practice a lot. I'm going to come back to that in the next slide, I believe. And medication if needed. If you're really struggling, talk to your doctor. You're not the only one. I'm sure they've heard this from hundreds of people before. So stress coping, it empowers us against feelings of vulnerability that accompany uncertainty. If we can manage our stress, it makes the uncertainty just a little bit more bearable. So I talked about exercise, the diet. A lot of ideas about what to do with diet and stress coping. In general, the Mediterranean diet is the best diet in the world. What is the Mediterranean diet? It's mostly plants, not completely, nothing refined, and a lot of fresh ingredients. So leafy greens, olive oil, legumes, meaning beans, nuts, whole grains, very little refined sugar, very little. Honey, wild-caught seafood, very little red meat, maybe once or twice a month. Very little poultry, maybe once or twice, maybe 2 or 3 times a month. Wild-caught seafood is the most animal-based protein. No milk, but dairy products are okay. They're fermented, yogurt, cheese, things like that. This diet is based on what was observed in the Mediterranean between 1947 and 1960. The area was shattered by World War II. There's a complete lack of infrastructure. But for some reason, these people had amazing cardiovascular health. And so people went there to research what they were eating, and this is what they found. Time and again, when people get on the Mediterranean diet, it's heart healthy, it's brain healthy, it's cancer prevention, it's cancer recovery. So this is what I really recommend to everybody. Some people swear by keto. Doesn't work for me. I get brain fog that I can't get past. I can't work on a keto diet. Some people recommend paleo. Absolutely not. That's a very unhealthy diet to use. There's all sorts of variations, vegan, vegetarian. If you're going to start with one of these things, please talk to your doctor and make sure it's appropriate for you. If we can't do the perfect diet, just try to make healthier choices when possible, right? If your diet consists mostly of fast food, maybe don't supersize. If it consists of a lot of red meat, maybe add a salad there instead of potatoes once in a while. Just do the best you can. So, I already went over sleep hygiene. There's a couple things I left out. Very important. Get out of bed. Get out of bed in the morning. Don't stay in bed, even if it's just in the chair. Your body learns otherwise, that the bed is where you hang out and it's not where you sleep. And when you're trying to go to sleep in the bed, you won't. So it's very important to get out of bed. Wind down in the morning and wind up in the morning. Wind down at night and wind up in the morning. Oftentimes what I tell people is good sleep hygiene begins when you wake up in the morning, and the difference between what you do in the morning and what you're doing at night. Alcohol and THC, a lot of people using medical marijuana. They both reduce dreaming and restorative sleep if used regularly. Alcohol doesn't take much. THC builds up in your system. Before you know it, it suppresses dreaming. So people have all sorts of strange experiences when they're dreaming. And reduce caffeine. We're in the 305 down here with Cuban coffee, but I found through the aging process myself that if I have coffee in the afternoon, I can go to sleep just fine, but I'm gonna wake up at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. So you may want to reduce caffeine overall. So meditation, this is something I spend a lot of time with people doing, and I spend a lot of time myself. In fact, I credit this meditation practice with giving me almost 25 years in this field, working with people going through cancer treatment. I try to think of it as a more physical practice than a mental one. One thing that almost everybody says when I bring up meditation, oh, it doesn't work for me, I can't empty my mind. And I tell them, funny thing is, neither can I, and I've been doing it for decades. So don't think about emptying your mind. It's really more about connecting the flow of the mind with the breath, diaphragmatic breathing, belly breathing. So breath awareness in general, I think, is the cornerstone of meditation practices. What you want to do is make sure you're doing diaphragmatic breathing, which is belly breathing, yogic breathing. If you want to put your one hand, which I'm doing right now, you can put one hand on your belly. And as you inhale, imagine there's like a balloon in your belly. You're going to inflate that balloon when you inhale, and then just gently squeeze the air. Your belly's like a pump. You're just going to pump that air out gently through your belly. Slow and steady, slow and steady. This reduces the stress response very quickly. For some people, it's more effective to do what's called box breathing, where this is based on the number 4. Now, this is being recorded, I think, so you can have access to it if you're taking notes and having a hard time catching up. So box breathing is based on the number 4. You inhale for a count of 4, hold it for a count of 4, exhale for a count of 4, and then pause for a count of 4. So it's an equal-sided box made with your breath. Why is this so incredibly effective? Because your mind is focused on counting the breath. Your mind is focused on your breath, and it can't do more than 2 or 3 things at once. So it's very difficult for it to continue to ruminate when it's just counting the breath. So this turns off that ruminative cycle. It diminishes the stress response because it's focusing on breathing. When we're focused on breathing, it's inherently relaxing, typically. 4-7-8. This is the rapid rescue, right? Inhale for a count of 4, hold it for a count of 7, exhale for a count of 8. Instant attitude adjustment within 3 breaths. You do that for 5 or 10 minutes, and you will have a very different experience of the next hour of your life than you would otherwise. So I encourage everybody to practice this. Inhale for a count of 4, hold it for a count of 7, exhale for a count of 8. If that's too demanding, I think the general rule of thumb for most people is that if your exhale is longer than your inhale, you're going to experience a stress reduction benefit. It's just getting rid of some of that excess carbon dioxide.